The studio lights bore down with an almost merciless intensity, illuminating Serena Williams in her tailored suit, a woman who had once commanded stadiums, now seated in a chair designed for casual chatter about retirement. The audience buzzed, with the easy excitement of people expecting laughter, anecdotes, maybe a few emotional reflections on a storied career. Yet beneath the surface of her composed smile, the air already carried the weight of her history. The jeers at courtside, the constant scrutiny of her body, the whispers of doubters who said she was too different, too strong, too black to belong. She had lived her career on the edge of contradiction, revered as a champion, but treated as an outsider. The host leaned forward, his rehearsed grin faltering slightly as a hand pressed to his earpiece. "Serena, we have a special surprise guest," he announced, his voice carrying an edge of mystery. The giant screen behind her flickered, static, lines crackling across the glass until a face appeared, solemn and unfamiliar to many in the room but commanding in presence. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. The audience gasped audibly, the ripple of disbelief moving like a tide. Serena's back straightened, her practiced composure faltering for the first time in the interview. Her eyes widened, caught between curiosity and a sudden unspoken fear that this moment would not be the harmless detour it first seemed. Traoré's voice entered the room like a low thunder. "Madame Serena," he began, his French accent lacing every syllable with weight. "I do not speak to the champion the world celebrates. I speak to the woman who carried the weight of dreams." The crowd hushed, as though someone had pulled a cord from the wall and drained the electricity from the air. Serena's lips parted, but no words emerged. The cameras captured her frozen expression, a woman more used to roaring triumphs than unexpected confessions. The narration of her life shifted in an instant, from victories and trophies to a reckoning with meaning itself. Traoré's eyes on the screen held no performance, only conviction. "When a girl in my country carves a racket from wood," he said slowly, "it is because she saw you. She saw a woman the world doubted, holding trophies the world said she could never hold." The sentence hung in the studio like smoke, thick and impossible to ignore. Serena's throat tightened, the air suddenly too heavy to swallow. Her fingers gripped the armrest of her chair, knuckles whitening as if she were back on the court, rallying against an unseen opponent. She whispered almost involuntarily, I don't know what to say." The admission cracked through the silence. Raw and vulnerable, the host glanced nervously at the audience, as though worried that the script had slipped too far from control, but the viewers in the studio were transfixed. Not a cough, not a shuffle, just the collective stillness of people watching history shift before them. A single tear gathered at the corner of Serena's eye, betraying the composure she had fought to maintain. It slipped down her cheek, glistening in the harsh white light. Another followed. The audience sat in stunned silence, witnesses not to the farewell of a sports legend, but to the breaking open of her soul. The camera lens closed in, the world watching through glass and pixels as the woman who had borne 1,000 battles now trembled beneath the weight of being seen, truly seen. And in that breath, the moment turned, not toward laughter, not toward applause, but into the quiet cliff of revelation, where everything that had once been hidden stood at the edge, ready to fall. The tear that slid down Serena's cheek did not stop at the surface. It cut deep, unlocking doors she had tried for years to keep closed. Traoré's words lingered like a shadow in her chest, each syllable pulling her backward through time, forcing her to face the weight of everything she had endured to stand in that studio. The silence of the audience stretched, and in that silence, her mind replayed the sound of boos echoing from the stands at Indian Wells. She had been young then, barely more than a girl, yet she had walked through a tunnel of hostility, strangers screaming insults that carried more venom than any opponent. Across the net. She remembered clutching her racket so tightly her palm ached, forcing her legs to keep moving, even as her heart told her to run away. She had walked off that court not in defeat, but in exile. The flash burned in her memory. A commentator's voice, calm but dismissive, slicing through the broadcast like a quiet knife. "She doesn't belong here," he said, and millions heard it. Millions repeated it. Those words had trailed her like shadows at every victory. Even her triumphs were not hers to savor. They were interrogated, dissected, questioned. Her body too muscular, her strength too unfeminine, her very presence too defiant of what tennis had decided was acceptable. Nights came when she lay in her room, the trophies gleaming on the shelf but offering no comfort. She cried into her pillow, her sobs muffled so no one could hear the cracks in her armor. Yet every morning she rose again, tying her shoes, stepping back into arenas that had already judged her before the first serve. The studio screen glowed with Traoré's image, but his voice now braided itself with those memories, speaking to the wounds the world had left unacknowledged. His empathy gave shape to the invisible battles she had fought alone. In the crowd, a reporter leaned toward a colleague, his voice low, nearly reverent. "She fought racism with silence," he whispered, "and still they tried to break her." The words floated into the heavy air, truth spoken softly but carrying the force of thunder. Serena's breath caught. The truth had never been about broken rackets or raised voices. It was about endurance, the quiet insistence to keep standing. Somewhere in the folds of memory, another voice surfaced, smaller, fragile, belonging to a child. A flashback within a flashback, a young girl in school, clutching a tattered notebook, whispering to herself, "They called me names. But then I saw Serena win. I knew I could too." That voice, though imagined now, pressed against her ribs until she could almost hear it in the studio, echoing louder than the applause that used to greet her victories. The conflict was no longer personal. It spread like cracks through the veneer of the sport she had given her life to. Systemic injustice lay in the officiating decisions that punished her more harshly than others, in the headlines that painted her rage while excusing the same in her peers, in the audiences that expected her to bow without complaint. It was the invisible architecture of racism built into the courts themselves, polished to gleam while hiding the rot beneath. Across the ocean, in a land where most of the audience had never set foot, the parallel played itself out. Girls gathered, in dusty courtyards, barefoot, their rackets carved crudely from branches and wire, their dreams fragile but persistent. They swung with laughter, with hope, because somewhere on a screen, sometimes fuzzy, sometimes faint, they had seen her. Serena Williams, a woman who looked like them, who proved the world's ceiling was just another sky to break through. Traoré's words had carried that truth into the studio, weaving her past to their present, binding her struggle to their beginnings. And as the images of both worlds overlapped, her battles against polished prejudice and their games on cracked earth, Serena felt the scope of her journey shifting. She had thought she was fighting for respect, for recognition, for the right to lift a trophy without caveats. But now she saw that every serve, every step, every tear shed in silence had been for something larger. She had been fighting not for titles, but for dignity itself, for the right to exist without apology, for a place in history that no sneer could erase. Her chest rose and fell, the weight of realization pressing down. The cameras caught her face, but what they could not capture was the storm inside her, the memories colliding with the present, the pain blooming into clarity. And as the studio held its breath, waiting for what might come next, the narration of her life rewrote itself in her own mind. It was no longer about victories counted in numbers. It was about truths carved in scars, about the millions who saw themselves in her resilience. And now, the world was watching. Not her victory, but her truth. The memory of boos and whispers still hung in the air when the next scene unfolded, as though time itself wanted to test how far the truth could travel. The clip of Serena's tears and Traoré's words had already circled the globe, shared across millions of screens, igniting a demand for something greater than sympathy. It all built to a day that carried the weight of a verdict, not in a courtroom bound by laws, but in a hall flooded with cameras and microphones, every lens pointed at the stage where Serena and Traoré now stood together. The setting felt like judgment, a reckoning not just of one career, but of the systems that had tried to cage it. The flashbulbs erupted like storms, but their light could not outshine the gravity in Traoré's voice. He did not raise it, yet every syllable landed. With thunder, "Racism is not a stadium problem," he declared, his tone measured, each word echoing as though it carried centuries behind it. "It is the silence in every system, and silence is violence." The hall fell still, a silence that was no longer complicit but attentive, bracing for the impact of truth. Screens around the world replayed his words instantly, clips slicing through news channels, comment sections erupting as though the walls of denial had cracked open. Behind the flash of cameras, the narrative shifted to those who had stood against. Serena. Commentators replayed saying she did not belong, slow-motion clips of unfair penalties, freeze frames of faces in crowds twisted with contempt. The antagonists, once smug in their authority, now flickered across screens like relics of a decayed order, their collapse narrated not by shouting, but by the unrelenting replay of their own prejudice. In that charged air, Serena rose. She did not gesture grandly, did not try to command the room with theatrics. Her trembling hands steadied themselves on the podium, her voice low but unwavering. "I was told I was too strong, too black, too loud," she began, her words threading into the silence with precision. "But today I know I was enough, more than enough." The microphones caught the slight break in her tone, a catch in her breath, but it did not weaken her. It sharpened the edge of her confession. Each phrase struck at the heart of those who had mocked her power, those who had mistaken her resilience for rage. She did not need to point fingers. She became the mirror itself, reflecting the rot of racism back onto the world that had cultivated it. Narration filled the spaces her words left, the unease in boardrooms where executives watched, the hollow silence of commentators whose clips had resurfaced, the shifting eyes of institutions that once denied their role. She was no longer the hunted, no longer the story being shaped by others. She was the one holding the mirror, and every crack in the reflection belonged not to her, but to those who had tried to erase her. The audience inside the hall held their breath, transfixed by the calmness of her stance, the steadiness of a woman who had endured storms and stood unbroken. And then, like a dam bursting, the silence broke. Applause surged, but it was not the kind reserved for victory on a scoreboard. It was a roar born of recognition, of shame released, of solidarity demanded. The cameras captured faces wet with tears, fists raised not in aggression but in acknowledgement. Around the world, living rooms erupted in cheers, hashtags flooded, timelines, voices that had been small suddenly found echo. The antagonists, commentators, critics, even governing bodies, were reduced to silence, their collapse not in dramatic defeat but in irrelevance. Their words, once carried with power, now seemed brittle, laughable against the strength of this moment. Serena stood still as the sound rose, not basking, not celebrating, but letting the truth settle into the bones of everyone present. Traoré, beside her, remained quiet, his role not to overshadow but to affirm. His earlier declaration, "Silence is violence," now lived in the roar of voices breaking silence together. And yet for Serena, The moment was not about noise. It was about the stillness within her, the calm knowledge that she had no more to prove. She had walked through decades of doubt and emerged not with another trophy, but with something larger, the authority of her own truth. Cameras zoomed in as her eyes swept the hall, no longer trembling but fierce and clear. For once the world did not cheer a champion's win. It bowed to a woman's truth. The roar that had filled the hall did not fade easily, but as days passed it transformed into something quieter, heavier, more permanent. The reckoning did not arrive with fireworks or confetti. It arrived in silence, in the hushed corners of rooms where people were forced to confront themselves. A critic who had once tweeted that Serena was too aggressive scrolled through his old words late into the night, staring at the venom he had written in casual cruelty. His finger hovered before he pressed delete, the shame heavier than any applause he had ever courted. In a suburban neighborhood, a man who had once told his children not to play with the black family down the street found himself lowering his eyes when that same family walked past. No speeches, no confrontation, just the quiet gravity of guilt, folding his shoulders inward. Phones rang in offices of commentators who had mocked her, but the calls went unanswered. The world had turned its gaze elsewhere, and the silence on the other end of the line was its own form of justice. While these fragments of collapse rippled through unseen corners, Serena's life moved in a different current. She stepped onto the red earth of Burkina Faso, not as a celebrity on tour, but as a woman drawn to the voices that had whispered hope through static television screens. In a small community center, the moment arrived. Awa, the little girl who had held onto a wooden racket carved from scraps, stood trembling in a simple dress, her eyes wide as Serena knelt before her. The room held its breath as Serena placed a brand new racket in her hands, its strings taut, its frame gleaming under dim light. Awa gasped, clutching it as though it were a treasure beyond value. Her voice was soft, trembling but steady. "Miss Serena," she whispered, "I'll make you proud." Tears blurred Serena's vision as she pulled the child into her arms. Her reply came with the weight of truth. "You already have." Around them the crowd erupted in applause, not for championships, but for the quiet miracle of possibility becoming real. Across the globe, images of children holding rackets, some new, some handmade, flooded timelines. They raised them like torches, symbols of a new solidarity that had begun with a tear shed on live television. Online movements pressed louder for reform in sports institutions, demanding equal treatment, demanding accountability. Hashtags evolved into petitions, petitions into policies. The tide did not change overnight, but it had begun to move, and it carried with it the voices that had once been invisible. In the quiet of her own reflection, Serena gave the world one last message. Standing before the sea of faces in Burkina Faso, with children's laughter echoing in the background, she spoke softly but firmly. "Greatness is not holding trophies," she said, her eyes sweeping the crowd. "It is holding the hand of a child who dares to dream. If my tears opened one eye, one heart, then my fight was worth it." The words landed gently but firmly, the kind of truth that does not fade when applause ends. That night, as she walked through a cheering crowd, the air alive with chants of her name, Serena's gaze was not on the cameras or the headlines waiting to be written. It was fixed on the quiet echo of her own promise, the promise that hope, once planted, would outlive injustice. She knew that the applause would fade, that headlines would shift, but the seed had been sown in the heart of every child who had ever been told they were not enough. And as she disappeared into the night, hand brushing against the hands of those who reached out for her, the truth carried itself forward, silent and unstoppable. Hope had been passed on, and it would endure.